Hi there! Welcome back to another video on my channel, and welcome back to another Writers Wednesdays. I am Cassie Van Gundy. I am the author of Cursed Fate, just in case you've never seen a video in the series before. Yeah, I'm Cassidy. This is Cursed Fate. This is my debut work, and this is a series where I give anybody who's interested in being a writer, or anybody who's interested in writing in general, or interested in what it's like to publish a book, tips and tricks and stuff to help you guys out, hopefully. We are doing a spooky themed video because it is practically October. October is almost upon us. It's my favorite month. It's my favorite season. And because of that, we're just going to do a bunch of kind of more spookier themed writing videos on this channel. So yes, stay tuned for that. Today we're going to be talking about the genre of dark fantasy, which is what I write in, and everything that really defines what dark fantasy is, and like how you can get better at writing in this genre if you're interested in it as well. So if that sounds cool to you, just keep on watching. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of dark fantasy for you guys, in case you may not know. And knowing the history and knowing the concrete definition of dark fantasy might help you figure out tools in order to write a more compelling dark fantasy. So first and foremost, just pointing out fun tidbits that Gertrude Burroughs Bennett was the woman who was credited with inventing dark fantasy. I point that out because dark fantasy as a genre tends to be very male-dominated, tends to be heavily white, and so any little bit of diversity I find in this history, I will put it out there to you guys. I will talk more about diversity at the end of the video too, but I just wanted to throw that out there because I thought it was cool as a woman who writes in this genre. But basically, dark fantasy is pretty much kind of what is in its name. It is a subgenre of fantasy that focuses heavily on dark themes and pulls a lot from different horror elements and incorporates it into like some sort of fantastic setting. A lot of it tends to be wrapped around the idea of like supernatural horror too, not just like people horror or like serial killers, things like that. Although, you know, a lot of people use horror and dark fantasy interchangeably. There's technically some differences. Likewise, like if somebody was writing a fantasy story that took place in the real world but still incorporated like darker themes, some people would call that more of a contemporary fantasy, as opposed to a dark fantasy. Some people label dark fantasy only if it takes place in the majority of secondary worlds, which is what mine does. So this book does have scary elements to it. There are horror elements into it, very scary scenes, but the majority of it takes place in a secondary world that can be accessed through ours. So that's why Cursed Fate really fits into the dark fantasy genre. A lot of people use the word dark fantasy instead of horror just because horror tends to give off like the fact that this is going to be very graphic, or you know, it's too vivid, it's like completely scary. And there's nothing wrong with horror. Like I watch and read a ton of horror content, but dark fantasy is a little bit different because it's not purposely trying to be grotesque to just scare. It just happens to have some unsavory elements to it. Okay, so somebody else who has really popularized this word or coined this word for dark fantasy is Charles L. Grant, and he basically describes dark fantasy as a type of horror story in which humanity is threatened by some sort of outside force that's way beyond its understanding. I think this is very common in dark fantasy, or at least like the stereotypical dark fantasy that one would think of. Like, you know, I've mentioned H.P. Lovecraft before on this channel. I think Lovecraft's work fit into dark fantasy literally just based on this genre alone, because that's kind of like his whole thing in the Call of Cthulhu and everything else like that. Likewise, some people also label dark fantasy as works that really take a story from like a monster's point of view, and I have a couple examples of those. So The Sandman is a good example of that. The Vampire Chronicles and Saint Germain all kind of tell stories through the monster's perspective, and of course that's going to be a lot more darker than you would typically if you had like some sort of fantasy story through the main character's perspective. Likewise, Wagner, who is also somebody who's really popularized the term dark fantasy, argues that dark fantasy can also be some sort of high fantasy story. So high fantasy is like really big world building, D&D type stuff, magic, swordsman's, medieval stuff, you know, the works. So he thinks that dark fantasy can also be some form of high fantasy with main characters who act more of like anti-heroes, or who act more like anti-heroes, or they have like a corrupt protagonist or a morally ambiguous protagonist, because they're going to see the world a lot differently than your traditional protagonist would. Dark fantasy isn't just for like books and literary genres, but you can see dark fantasy in a lot of movies, especially anime and manga. Like, I feel like that's a really popular subgenre. So like if you're interested in like Berserk, I think technically that would be, or Madoka Magico Girls, oh my god, that's a dark fantasy. Which it's one of my favorite shows, but that messed me up really bad after I watched it for the first time. And then also Pan's Labyrinth is a very iconic piece of like dark fantasy. Okay, so now that we know what it is, and we know that we like to write in this genre, how can we get better at it? This is also kind of going to bleed into a little bit of a video I plan on doing in the future, or maybe like if I cover enough of it in this video, I'll just come up with something else. But I was going to make a video called like how to write scary scenes, right? How to really get in there and do these things. I think now that we've kind of outlined that dark fantasy is either A, borrow elements from horror movies in terms of plot descriptions, like antagonists, monsters, things like that. They still work in fantastical settings as well, or they incorporate the perspective of somebody who isn't like a pure hero, or somebody who's like an anti-hero, somebody who is the monster, somebody who is the villain, is through their perspective. So those three are kind of outlined ways to try to improve your writing, and if you keep those in mind, you will probably work better in this genre if this is the genre you want to commit to. If you want to commit to something like horror, then these rules might not necessarily apply, but these are applied for dark fantasy. So going off of the first one, like incorporating elements of horror and writing scary scenes, I think what works for me, and a lot of this advice is going to be through my personal experience, but what works for me is really building up your descriptions for the environment that your character is moving in, or, you know, using not necessarily Baroque language, or really Baroque language in terms of like hyper descriptive language, I think is an easier vehicle to build up tension for the reader. But likewise, it's very easy for the reader to get lost in it, so you have to do like a delicate balance. But I think you should really put effort into describing the scene, describing what the reader should be feeling like while they're entering the space, or describing what the main character is feeling when they're entering the space. Just having things ooze off the walls, like being very deliberate with verbing, with adjectives, really like building tension as well, letting the main character know that they are on edge. And so maybe if they're doing things that reflect that, like if they're like what I'm doing, I'm playing with my hands, right? Or if their palms are sweating, like, you know, like when I get a shot, I have a panic attack. So the first thing I do is my palms are really sweaty, right? And I'm just staring off and trying to hyper focus on something to distract myself from what's to come. Lots of tension building, body movements, descriptions, warping with the senses of time can also be indicative of not only fantasy, but like horror elements in fantasy. Just go there, like go over the top. If it feels scary to you, just write it out. You know what I mean? I think a lot of writing you can pre-plan and you do a lot of stuff for, but in the moment, a lot of it's kind of intuitive. So just go with what you think feels right in terms of description. Obviously, it helps to get second opinions. So there's one scene in particular I asked my husband to read because I didn't know if it was too much. It's in chapter 6 of Cursed Fate, and something happens that's very jarring, and so I had him read it, and he was like, oh boy. But we ended up keeping it in because it was very substantial to the book, and it was a very shocking moment for the character, and then that kind of set the tone for the rest of the scenes. I think I should also point out too that like dark fantasy tends to have this air of like hopelessness, or like an overall tone of just dread. I think is the best word. So that should be a tone that's set from the beginning of your work to the very end. Like this sense of dread, this sense of impending doom. Even if one foe is beaten, there's something else bigger coming through. And I think that's what really separates it into like dark fantasy. If you're trying to the angle of like things are happening that are outside humans' capacity for understanding, I think that also relies on description, but in a different way. So I'm comparing things like saying the creature has tentacle-like features, not necessarily just saying like, oh, it has tentacles, but tentacle-like makes it seem like this isn't quite on the money in terms of description, or like recognizing that when you're describing the character, you're doing the best with what you have and having limited knowledge. I think Lovecraft did a lot of this, but he also said like, oh my God, you wouldn't even believe what you're seeing. That's something that I don't really do. I think there's ways to incorporate mystery around something without just being purposely vague. But to each their own. If you want to go that route, you can totally go that route too. So now let's talk about like writing the protagonist or writing the perspective. So obviously we have the option where you can write the story from the villain's perspective. I think this is very popular, especially with like story retellings. So like I know Disney, I don't know why this is the first example that popped in my head, but I know Disney's doing this new book stories where they basically give the villains like all these origin stories. And I know they're doing that with their movies too. We can all feel some kind of way about it. I don't know. I think Maleficent was really cool, but I was not on board with Cruella. I'm sorry. I did not like that movie. There's reasons why I don't like that movie, and I can talk about that some other time. But it's this idea of like a darker story. You have a villain's origin story, which means like there's going to be a bad ending, right? You have this tone already set that something negative happened, is happening, is going to happen. They're an anti-hero. They're some sort of morally ambiguous protagonist. With my story, again, I'm just using this as a reference because it's what I wrote and what I know. My protagonist, Vincent, he isn't like an antagonist, I don't think, but I don't think he's your conventional type of protagonist. He tends to have like an attitude. He's very quick to trust, and I think he recognizes his own faults, and he recognizes that he's just kind of moving through the story to get to a specific goal for him, and he kind of forges friendships along the way, but like at the very beginning he's very clear that he's only doing this to find his father. So I don't think he's like really morally ambiguous. I just think he's kind of a bit of an asshole sometimes. But you can obviously go very, very, very literal and have like retell like Dracula from the perspective of a vampire. You could, I mean, I think even Mary Shelley does this at some point in time because she does write through the monster's perspective at least some point in time in the book. But even having an entire book through like Frankenstein's monster's perspective would be one thing. I think it's like a reclaiming kind of thing, especially for like, I can see this being really cool for like villains who are traditionally outcasted based on things like sex, gender, sexuality, things like that. I think that'd be really cool, like somebody who's like condemned for their flamboyancy in the past, retelling their story and owning their narrative, or like even for a lot of things for like minorities and stuff. I think that'd be really cool. But yeah, that's one option for you if you want to work on your dark fantasy through that lens. Third of all, it could just be vibes. Like this is the least complicated like sort of tip, but it could even just be vibe. Like I know some people refer to it as like gothic fantasy, but even just being like dark and gloomy all the time, even just setting it in a gloomy setting, like even if you just have like a normal mystery story, but like say it takes place in the real world, but there's supernatural creatures afoot and every day is raining, right? I mean, or you're in this fantastical setting where there's no sun. So even by itself, the environment does enough to set the mood to make it a dark fantasy. And I really stress that because I I'm someone who likes to work a lot with setting. Dialogue is hard for me. So I spend whole days writing dialogue. But setting is an easy way to set up the vibes and set up the mood. Even if you just have like somebody with a lot of angst, I feel like that could really help. I mean, my main character has a shit ton of angst. You could, yeah, you could do it where it's a setting that's dark and having that darkness in your setting, if there is no sun, will inevitably affect the psyche of your main characters, because, you know, if you're in the dark too long, your body starts to react certain ways, right? Like your vision changes, your mental health changes, like all this sort of stuff changes, and it's an easy plot device to carry on and force the characters to do things. So even something as simple as just making it dark could really just, you know, really help your dark fantasy take shape. Yeah, this is the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This is like a relatively short little video just spewing out some history and fun facts and advice. If you have more specific questions, please leave them in the comments down below. I always answer my comments, even if they're maybe a day late. I will always get back to comments, and if you have any suggestions for future videos, if you find this one, please also leave that in the comments down below. I'd love to hear them. If you are also interested, I have a makeup series that's going on too, where I've just been doing Halloween makeup to fit in with the spooky season. So if you're interested in that, that's cool too. But yeah, I just wanted to make this video because I'm really into this genre, and I'm just trying to, sometimes I feel like it's just hard to really progress as a woman and as like a member of the LGBTQ community. It's like kind of, even though this genre is literally made for us, in my opinion, like the amount of queer-coded villains and retelling of villain stories that reflect around like the plights of disenfranchised people are crazy. But the fact that disenfranchised people aren't the ones writing and telling their own stories kind of pisses me off. This is a genre that's very, very overall very white, and I'd like to see more diversity happen in these spaces. And I think we should be trying to come up with more welcoming spaces anywhere we go. But I know that in this business, most of my audience is, I want my audience to be as wide and varied as anybody else's audience in any other genre. And I want to bring more people into dark fantasy. I really do. I want it to be a more welcoming space, because right now it's just not very diverse, and I think that's really important. So that's kind of like why I'm making these videos, and why I'm going to continue making videos just about writing in general, because I want people to feel like they can do this no matter where they come from. But yeah, so again, if you're vibing with that message too, and you want to support me, go ahead and like the video, comment down below, share with a friend, and subscribe to the channel. Please, please, please. That would help me a lot, more than you ever know. And until next time, thanks. Bye.